Good morning. We will start. And I have the pleasure of introduce Dr. Valérie Siroux, who is Director of Research of a very famous unit of INSERM working on environmental epidemiology, and she's a specialist of air pollution. She will spoke on online, and I will give her the microphone. Valérie, c'est à vous. Vous m'entendez?
Oui, parfait, merci. Hello, everybody. So first, I want to apologize for not being with you today, but it was absolutely impossible for me to be there. And I am pleased to introduce environmental epidemiology in this international course. So I will first share my screen. Here it is. So I'm co-leading a team of environmental epidemiology applied to development and respiratory health at INSERM in Grenoble. And I will talk today about environmental epidemiology, exposome, and biomarkers, as it was in the title, but let's say it's how to assess environment for this environmental epidemiology research. So as for the introduction, I will first start by saying that actually the fact that the environment could have an impact on health is really not a recent idea. Hippocrates, in his treatise Airs, Waters, and Places, clearly associates seasons, prevailing winds, and the quality of the air and water with the physical condition of people and the occurrence of disease. And actually, in the middle of the 19th century, the medicine integrates a social dimension that was actually particularly decisive to face infectious disease that was the main threat for health of the population at that time. And so in practice, it means that actions or control of the environment, like water quality and waste management, was important to were the most important actions actually to avoid the development of the disease. So actually, it was more prevention. One important aspects in the past that really well illustrate these social medicines is the outbreak of cholera in 1955 in London. As you probably know, there was a huge outbreak of cholera in London at the time, and actually John Snow, who was a medical doctor, but actually with one of the first epidemiologists, I would say, was able by trying to really identify where the location of the cases were able to identify that actually it was contaminated water what was responsible of the cholera. And at that time it was really a novel result, because actually we were thinking that cholera was in the air, actually some things people were breathing. But so it was one of the first, not understanding anything about the disease, but able to understand actually that it was a water pump in London that was responsible for this outbreak. And by shutting down this water pump, he was able actually to face this and to stop this outbreak. So it was one important illustration of this social medicine in a way. And with the post-war period, actually, there was a dominance of the biomedical model, which means that actually we emphasize much more therapeutic innovation, treatment, so how to treat the patients. And it's actually led to a devaluation of the social medicine in a way, and to the prevention in a way at the same time. So actually the public health focuses mainly on individual behaviors like tobacco, alcoholism, but really few on other environmental factors at that time. in parallel, and actually not without any link, we had an epidemiological transition.
Une
What it
transition
means,
épidémiologique
an epidemiological transition is characterized by a complex
est
change in the
caractérisée
patterns of
par des
health and
changements
disease.
complexes
As you
en
can see
matière
on
de
the right
santé et
side
de
of the
maladie.
slide,
À droite de
there was a
l'écran,
decrease in
vous avez
mortality
une baisse
related to
de la
infectious
mortalité
disease,
liée
but
aux
at the
maladies
same time, a
infectieuses
huge
et en même temps
increase
une
of the
augmentation
mortality due
de
to
taille des
chronic
mortalités
disease.
liées aux maladies
So actually,
chroniques.
now we are facing an epidemic of
Maintenant,
chronic
nous avons
disease,
une épidémie de
so
maladies
including
chroniques,
cardiovascular disease,
donc les
cancer,
maladies
diabetes, chronic
cardiovasculaires,
pulmonary
le
disease, for
cancer,
example.
le diabète,
This
les
is
maladies
about
pulmonaires
70% of deaths
chroniques
worldwide
qui
related to
représentent
these
environ
chronic diseases.
70% des
And as
morts
it is in terms of etiology, it's quite
en matière
very different
d'étiologie.
compared to infectious
C'est très
disease.
différent par rapport aux
Actually,
maladies
we have a
infectieuses.
really complex multifactorial etiology
Nous avons
related to the
une
chronic
étiologie
disease
multifactorielle
involving
très
gene,
complexe
environment, but
avec les
gene
gènes,
by environment,
l'environnement,
gene and environment by
les gènes
environment
par
interaction.
l'environnement, les gènes par les gènes et l'environnement par les environnements.
But actually, in the last years, or let's say in this last decades, there is quite strong evidence to suggest that actually there is a major role of environment in the development of these chronic diseases. And there is different aspects to underline that point. The first is that there was an increased prevalence over a short period of time for these chronic diseases, and we know that the genetic drift cannot be something that can happen in half a century. This is something that needs a much longer period of time. So it really points out the role of environment, and in particular, environmental factors that actually arose or that change in terms of nature, of prevalence during that time. And importantly, we had a profound transformation of the society with industrialization at that time that has for consequences many change in our environment and lifestyle evolution. The environment we are exposed to today is much more complex compared to the environment 2 decades before, given the chemicals we are exposed to, for example, and at the same time, our lifestyle has changed. If you think about diet or physical activity, we really have different lifestyles today as compared to a century before. And in all this, when I'm talking about environment, actually, we have to understand that these environmental factors as a whole. It includes physical factors, lifestyle and social factors, biological factors, including viruses, bacteria, and chemical factors, including medical treatment, endocrine disruptors, for example. So we really have to understand that environment is not only, let's say, for example, chemical factors, but it really includes all these factors that are not intrinsic of the individual, but something that comes from outside.
Et qui sont externes.
So now, why epidemiological studies are actually needed to identify these environmental factors?
Épidémiologiques nécessaires pour identifier ces facteurs.
First, we can say that if the exposure is visible,
nous pouvons d'abord dire que
you
si
can
cette
really
frontière
see
est visible, vous pouvez vraiment la voir.
If it had an intermediate effect on the
Si elle a un
disease,
effet
which
intermédiaire
means
sur
that
la
we would
maladie,
have a short period of
ça veut dire
latency
qu'on a une
between
courte
the
période de
exposure
latence
and
entre
the initiation of
l'exposition
the disease.
et le déclenchement
If
de la
it has a
maladie.
systematic effect of the
Si
disease,
cela a un effet
which means
systématique
that
sur la
all
maladie,
exposed individuals
ça veut
will
dire que tous
develop
les
the
individus
disease. If
exposés
it
vont
has a
développer la
strong
maladie,
effect and
et si
a
cela a un effet
specific
fort
effect, meaning that
et
the
un effet
disease
spécifique,
really
c'est-à-dire
appears
que la
without the
maladie apparaît
exposure.
rarement sans
then in
exposition.
that context,
Dans ce
case
contexte,
studies might be efficient to
les études de
evidence the
cas
impact of the
pourraient
environmental factor on
s'avérer
health. You really
efficaces
don't
pour
need
mettre en relief l'impact
to do
des
a lot
facteurs
of research.
environnementaux sur
You
la
can really well
santé.
identify these
Nous pouvons très
environmental
bien
factors.
identifier ces
But
facteurs
if the
environnementaux.
characterization of the
Maintenant,
exposure
si la
is
caractérisation
difficult,
de
if you think, for
l'exposition est
example, about
difficile,
characterizing
pensez par exemple
air pollution, you cannot
à
see air
caractériser la
pollution.
pollution atmosphérique, on ne peut pas la voir.
If the effect on the disease are
Si
delayed, for
les effets de
example,
la
if
maladie
there
sont
is a
retardés,
long period of
par
latency between the
exemple, s'il y a une forte
exposure and
période
the
de latence
initiation of
entre
the disease,
l'exposition
if the
et le déclenchement de la
exposure are
maladie,
rare
si
among the
l'exposition
exposed
est
subjects,
rare par rapport aux
and
sujets
if the
exposés
effects
et
are
si les effets ne
unspecific,
sont pas spécifiques,
then the case studies will not
dans ce
be
cas,
helpful. You
l'étude de
cannot
cas ne sera pas
identify
utile.
any environmental
Vous
factor
n'allez
in
pas
that
pouvoir
condition,
identifier
and
de
you really
facteurs
need an
environnementaux. Et
epidemiological
vous aurez vraiment
research
besoin
to identify
d'une
these factors.
recherche épidémiologique pour les
So what
identifier.
is actually the definition of epidemiology? I
Quelle
will
est la
say
définition de
that the one
l'épidémiologie?
from last is probably the most used one
On utilise le
that
plus la
characterize
dernière.
epidemiology as a study of distribution and determinants of
C'est une
health
étude de
related
distribution
to states or
qui détermine la
events in
santé
specific
liée
population
aux États,
and
aux
application of this
événements
study
dans
to
des
the
populations
control
spécifiques
of health
et
problems.
l'application de cette
So it's
étude
more
au
public
contrôle de
health.
problèmes
So
de
this is
santé.
clearly a fundamental science in public health. And the essential role of epidemiology is to improve the
Le
health
rôle
of
de
the population,
l'épidémiologie est d'améliorer la
in
santé de la
particular
population,
through preventive
notamment
measures to be
par le
able
biais de
to
mesures
avoid
préventives
the initiation
pour
of the disease rather
éviter que la
than
maladie
to
ne se
invest all
déclare
our
plutôt que
efforts in
d'investir
treating the
tous nos
patients. It is
efforts
important,
à
of course,
traiter
I
le
will not
patient.
discuss that point,
Bien sûr, c'est
but prevention is
difficile
an
d'en discuter,
important
mais la
aspect and with
prévention est un aspect
that is
important
really important in terms of the society
au
in
niveau
terms
de
of
la
cost.
société et en
So
matière de coût.
health is a state of, in that context, health is
Dans
a state of complex physical,
la santé
mental, and
est un
social
état
well-being, and not merely the
de
absence of
bien-être
disease
physique,
or
mental et
infirmity,
social, et pas
according
simplement
to the
l'absence
WHO
de maladie
definition.
et d'infirmité, conformément à la
So
définition
actually,
de
there is
l'OMS.
different type of
Il
epidemiology
y a
related to
différents
the
types
type of determinants
d'épidémiologie
we
en
are
fonction des
interested
différents types
in.
de
So for
déterminants.
environmental
Au
epidemiology,
niveau de l'environnement,
it's when it relates to any factor distinct from the
c'est tout
organism
facteur
and that
distinct
are
de
able to
l'organisme et
interact
qui
with
sont
it.
en mesure
Nutritional
d'interagir.
epidemiology is more
L'épidémiologie
focused on
nutritionnelle
diet,
qui se concentre davantage
so
sur le
nutrients,
régime,
food,
sur les
dietary
nutriments,
patterns,
les
obesity,
aliments,
physical activity usually
l'obésité
integrates
sur
this nutritional epidemiology too.
l'activité physique.
Social epidemiology, when we are focusing on
L'épidémie
social,
sociale
economic,
se
cultural
concentre
factors
sur des
related to
facteurs
disease.
socio-économiques et culturels liés à la
Clinical
maladie.
epidemiology that is
L'épidémiologie critique
usually related to therapy.
qui
So this is clearly
directement
where
liée
we
à la
focus on
thérapie. Nous
patients'
nous concentrons
outcome
sur les
and where we will be
patients
more interested in the
et
disease
nous sommes
variation,
plus
the evolution of
intéressés
the
par la
disease
variation de la
rather than
maladie, l'évolution,
the initiation of the
plutôt
disease.
que
And
l'enclenchement de la
genetic and
maladie.
molecular
Alors,
epidemiology is when we are
l'épidémiologie
focusing
génétique et
on
moléculaire,
either
on se
biomarker of
concentre
exposure,
sur les biomarqueurs de
susceptibility, and
l'exposition, sur la
their effect
susceptibilité
on
et les
outcomes.
effets sur
So
les
it's more
résultats.
well. What is really well known now is
Ce que l'on
genetic
connaît
and
très bien, c'est la
epigenetic and
génétique,
metabolomic research.
l'épigénétique, pardon.
So after this brief introduction, I
Après cette
will
rapide
present you
introduction,
some different aspects related
je vais
to
vous
environmental
montrer différents
epidemiology. First,
aspects
some
liés à
basics in
l'épigénétique
environmental epidemiology,
environnementale,
how to assess exposure
voir comment
in
évaluer
environmental
l'exposition
epidemiology, and I will end with
et
the
je
exposome
terminerai avec
approach.
l'approche de
So about the
l'exposé.
basics in environmental epidemiology.
Par rapport
So,
à
so you are
l'épidémiologie de
interested
base,
in an
vous êtes
association between
intéressé dans
environment
une
and health.
association entre
So actually, the
l'environnement et
environment has
la
some
santé.
sources, the
L'environnement des
emission of
sources,
the exposure that will
au niveau
lead
de
to
l'exposition, les émissions
different
qui
level
vont
of
lier,
exposure in
qui
the
vont donner lieu à
environment.
différents
So
niveaux
it will be
d'exposition
the
dans l'environnement.
concentration
Il y aura
in
la
the given
concentration
exposure in the given
dans
micro environment or
l'exposition donnée,
environment.
dans
So
le
if you think about
micro-environnement.
air pollution, the sources,
Au
let's
niveau
say
de la
that
pollution atmosphérique,
this is
il y a des
traffic, but
la
not the only one, but traffic, let's say. And
qui n'est pas
the
la
level
seule
in
source.
environment will be the measure of the pollutants in the
On
air.
mesurera
Then you have the
l'importance
personal
dans
exposures
l'air.
that
Ensuite, vous avez l'exposition
integrate the
personnelle
contact of the
qui
individual
intègre
with
le contact
the
entre l'individu
pollutants.
et les polluants.
So, for example, if you think
Par
about air
exemple,
pollution, it will
si vous
be
pensez à la pollution
how
atmosphérique,
much you spend
savoir
time
combien de temps
with
vous
physical activity outside.
consacrez
That
aux
will
activités
be
physiques à
something
l'extérieur.
that would change
Et c'est quelque chose
the
qui
individual exposure.
changera
Then
l'exposition
you have
individuelle.
internal doses of the
Ensuite, vous avez
exposure.
la
So this
dose
is the
interne de
quantity
l'exposition.
of
C'est la
pollutant
quantité des
absorbed in the
polluants
body.
absorbés
Then the
par le
dose in the
corps.
targeted organ,
Ensuite,
the
la dose dans les
biologically
organes
active
ciblés,
dose, which means the
une
quantity
dose
of pollutants that reach
biologiquement active,
really
c'est-à-dire
the
une quantité de
biological site of
polluants
action, such
qui
as a
atteint
specific
le site
organ. So if you
d'action
think
biologique
about
tel qu'un
some
organe spécifique.
but the lung, for example. And then you have the health
Ensuite,
effects
vous
related
avez les
to
effets
the
liés
impact of the exposure
au niveau
in
de
this
l'impact sur
organ.
l'exposition par rapport à ces
And actually,
organes.
there is different aspects that
Il y a
will
différents
play a role
aspects
in the
qui jouent un rôle
transition
dans la
from sources
transition
emission
au niveau des sources
to
d'émission
the health
vers
effects.
les effets sur la
So, for
santé.
example, between sources emission and the level in the air,
Entre les sources
there
d'émission
are
et le
some
niveau dans
exchanges
l'air,
between
il y
the
a des
different environmental
échanges
compartments
entre les
that
différents
might be
comportements
influenced by
environnementaux
other
qui peuvent être
factors. So, for example, if you
influencés
think
par d'autres
about air
facteurs.
pollution,
Pensez à la pollution atmosphérique.
air pollutants will be
Les
the
polluants
level in the
atmosphériques
environment will not
seront
be only related to the
ne sont pas
emission,
seulement
but
liés à
also to
l'émission,
weather and
mais
climate
également
conditions at that time.
aux
For
conditions
example,
climatiques,
with
au
the
temps
rain
du froid.
particles,
Par exemple,
there
avec la
is
pluie,
actually
les
no
particules.
particles because there are
En fait,
the water takes the particles in a way.
c'est l'eau qui absorbe
So
les
the weather will
particules.
play a major role
Le
between the emission and the
temps jouera
level
donc
in
un rôle
environment.
essentiel entre les
Then,
émissions et les
between the
métaux
level
d'environnement.
in the environment and
Ensuite,
personal exposure, behaviors
entre
will
le
play a
niveau de
major role
l'environnement et
here.
l'exposition
For example,
personnelle, il faut voir les comportements.
practicing activity during
Si la pratique
a
des
peak of air pollutant exposure
activités par
will
rapport
expose
à
the
un pic
individual
de
much
pollution,
more than if
où l'individu sera
you do not
davantage
practice
exposé par rapport à s'il ne
physical activity at that
pratique pas
time.
d'activité physique à
And
l'époque.
then between the personal exposures
Entre
and
l'exposition
the
personnelle
different
et
layers between internal
les
dose
différents
and dose in the
niveaux de
targeted
doses
organ.
internes et les
Then
doses
there is
ciblées dans les
the
organes.
effect of the body in
Il y a les effets
transformation,
du
elimination,
corps,
accumulation
la
of the
transformation,
exposure in the
l'élimination,
body that will be
l'accumulation,
involved.
qui vont être
And if you think,
impliquées,
for example,
qui
about physiology, ventilation,
pensez à
metabolisms, and individual
physiologie,
susceptibility,
à la
genetics,
susceptibilité
that will play
individuelle,
a role
qui vont jouer un rôle
in this transformation, elimination,
dans
accumulation of the pollutants in the body.
l'élimination et de l'accumulation
So
de
there's
ces composants.
two important kind of environmental epidemiological studies, the experimental versus the observational studies.
L'étude expérimentale
So
par rapport
clearly
à
in
l'étude
experimental
expérimentale,
studies, the principle is that
La
investigators
première, les
are
enquêteurs
applying treatments
appliquent
to
des
experimental
traitements
units,
à des
let's say
unités
people,
expérimentales, des
and
personnes,
then we'll
et vont
try to observe
tenter
whether the
d'observer
effect of this
si les
treatment
effets de ces
will change
traitements
something in the
changeront quelque
participants.
chose
So
au
clearly,
niveau des
one
participants.
big example is the
Un
randomized
exemple,
control trials,
ce
where you
sont
have a
les
control
essais
population
contrôlés randomisés.
and
Vous avez une
a group
population
of patients
contrôlée, un groupe
treated
de
with a new
patients que
treatment,
l'on
and
traite avec
you
un
will
nouveau
follow the
traitement.
population,
Vous
try
allez
to
suivre
identify
ces
whether
populations,
those that
tenter
are treated
d'identifier si ceux
actually
qui sont
have
traités
more favorable evolution as
ont
compared
une
to
évolution plus
untreated control
favorable que ceux
population.
qui ne sont pas traités.
So there's investigators really apply a treatment that is really different from
Les
observational
enquêteurs,
studies
dans
where
l'autre
actually
étude
investigators
observationnelle, les
only
enquêteurs
observe
observent les sujets,
subjects and
donc ne font
measure
qu'observer les sujets
variable of interest,
et
but
mesurent
without
les variables
assigning
d'intérêt
treatment to the
sans
subjects. So this is
attribuer
more real
des
life,
traitements au sujet. Ça, c'est plus la
actually
vie
studies on real
réelle,
life,
des
and
études sur la vie réelle qui sont
one
réalisées.
big example that we, let's say, a gold standard of observational studies are more the cohorts.
Et on a donc les cohortes, c'est la norme pour
So
ce
I
type
will not go in
d'observation.
depth of
Alors, je ne vais
each
pas entrer
type
dans
of
les
epidemiological
détails
studies, but
des
I think
types
it is really
d'études
important to have a better
épidémiologiques, mais
understanding of the
il est
different
important
type of
de
epidemiological
comprendre les
studies when
différentes
you
études
are reading
épidémiologiques.
some scientific
Lorsque vous
papers.
lisez une
One
occurrence
important
scientifique,
aspect is really
un
try
point
to understand
important
what
pour
are the
comprendre
type of epidemiological study applied,
le
because
type
they
d'études
all have
épidémiologiques.
actually strengths and weaknesses, and we are not using the same type of epidemiological research according to the aim of the study. So I will not have time to go in detail, but just have a brief overview of the different type of epidemiological studies I think could be useful for you. So if you are interested in the study of an association between environmental factor and health, the first question is, do the investigator control on the environmental factor? If that is the case, then you have in international studies, as I discussed just before. One big example is a randomized controlled clinical trial, but you have in environmental epidemiology, that's something that can be done, for example, so for ethical reason, if you suspect an environmental factor being a cause of a disease, you cannot do an interventional studies. From ethical reason, you can do that. But another way is, for example, to avoid some product that could be at risk for the individuals. So you can do an interventional study by removing these products from the participants for a short period of time and try, for example, to understand whether it has an effect on some biomarkers. That's something we are doing actually in our study, trying to understand the effect of endocrine disruptor, and so there is some young participants to which we provide substitutes for each product for the skin. So every product they are using are not allowed for a week, and so we are providing them some product that a priori are much better in terms of exposure to endocrine disruptors, and we will do that for a week and try to see whether indeed we can see some decrease in the metabolites of these endocrine disruptors. These are the kind of interventional studies that can be done, for example, in environmental epidemiology. And the other, so if you are not controlling for the environmental factors, you are in the observational studies. And then you have to ask, what is the unit of the analysis? If it's the individuals or the communities, are you looking at data from each individual or for a community? For example, the prevalence of smoking in different countries, so you are in a community, or if you are looking the smoking behavior of each individual in a cohort, so you are more on the individual side. So the unit of the analysis will be important here. So if you have some individual, then does the sampling depend on the health parameter? If that is the case, you have a case control study or a case crossover study. And if that's not the case, you will be in a cohort. Regarding, I will come back a bit later on that. And regarding if the unit of analysis are more communities, you are more on ecological studies, and what you have two kinds of, let's say, of studies in that case. Those that are time series analysis, where the comparison of community at different time points. So you are, for example, looking at the prevalence of incidence hospitalization for
l'incidence de
asthma,
l'hospitalisation pour
and you are
l'asthme.
trying to understand the effect of air pollutants. So
Vous
you
tentez de
will
comprendre
have a
l'effet de la
time
pollution
series
atmosphérique. Vous allez
with
avoir des séries de temps.
the hospitalization for asthma
Et
over time, let's say for a year, and at
l'hospitalisation au
the
niveau de
same
l'asthme
time,
pour, par exemple,
you
un mois.
have,
Et en
according
même
to
temps,
the air quality station,
par rapport
information about air
aux
pollutants, and
informations de la
you can try
qualité
to overlap these two time series to look
atmosphérique, vous allez
at
pouvoir
whether there is a correlation
voir
between
s'il y
the
a une
level of air
corrélation entre le
pollutants
niveau
and
de pollution
hospitalization for
atmosphérique
asthma.
et
And you have the
hospitalisation pour
ecological
l'asthme.
studies
Ensuite, vous avez les
that
études
is
écologiques.
actually where you compare different
Vous allez
communities, but at the
comparer
same
différentes
time.
communautés
So, for
en
example,
même
if
temps.
you want to look at the association
Si vous voulez regarder
between smoking and lung
l'association
cancer, actually it
entre
is
le
well known.
tabagisme
It
et
is
le
one of the
cancer,
most
ce qui est la plus connue,
important
et
factors
c'est l'un des
identified
facteurs
with
les
the
plus
highest
importants
risk in terms of
identifiés avec le
relative
risque le
risk
plus important, le risque
of
relatif.
about 9. But let's say that you can compare
Disons
actually
que
the smoking
comparer
the smoking in the at the general level in the population between different countries, and at the same time look at
de la population dans
the
les pays
prevalence
et en même
of
temps regarder la
lung cancer
prévalence
and try
du cancer des
to see
poumons
whether there is
et
a
tenter de
correlation
voir
or
s'il y a
not.
une
One
corrélation.
important thing, and we cannot go more on that,
Un point
but with this
important,
kind of ecological
c'est qu'avec ce
studies,
type d'études écologiques,
it provides you information
vous donne
whether
des
there are
informations
correlation, but
une corrélation.
there is an ecological fallacy,
Maintenant,
which is a bias where you can
il y a
see an
un
association at the
biais, on peut
community
voir
level,
une association
but
au
that
niveau
is
de
actually
la
not
communauté,
related to
mais qui n'est
an association
véritablement
at
pas
the individual level.
lié à
So
l'association au niveau
it is an
individuel.
important bias, so which means that
C'est un biais
ecological studies
important,
really
ça veut dire
provide
que les
some
études
important
écologiques donnent
information,
des informations
are able
importantes
to identify
qui permettent
some hypotheses, but we
d'identifier
always
des
should be a bit
hypothèses,
careful
mais
about
devons
translating
faire
results from these
attention
ecological studies
pour
as
traduire ces études
causes
écologiques
at the
comme étant
individual
des
level.
causes au niveau individuel.
So if we go back to the left side here, where
Si l'on en revient à gauche,
the observational studies were conducted at the individual level, then
au niveau
whether the
individuel,
sampling
il y aura un
depends on
échantillonnage qui
the
dépend
health parameter. If
des
that's the
paramètres de
case,
santé,
then you
et
have a
si
case
c'est le
control
cas, vous
study
avez une
or
étude
case
contrôlée
crossover
de cas
studies, and
ou
if
des
that's
études
not the case, you are more in a cohort or
ou des
cross-sectional
cohortes
study, but
ou des
not
études
dependent
professionnelles
on the health parameters. So
et qui ne
just to
dépendent pas
provide you a
des
better
paramètres
idea, in a cohort you are
de
recruited a
santé. Alors, dans une
population.
cohorte,
So for example,
une
pregnant
population, par
women
exemple,
in
des
one
femmes
town
enceintes
during
dans
a
une
year.
ville pendant
Then you will
un an.
follow this
Ensuite, vous allez
population
suivre cette
over time,
population
and
au
we
fil du
follow
temps.
the
Vous
newborn
allez
children,
suivre les
and you will
nouveaux-nés.
measure systematically exposures you are
Et
interested
on
in
va
over
faire
time,
systématiquement
and
les expositions au fil du temps.
and over time there is some children that will develop some disease, but you can be
vont
interested in
développer des
other health
maladies,
parameters
mais vous
like
pouvez être intéressé par ces paramètres de
the
santé,
growth curve of the participants, and you will try to relate
tels
the
que la courbe des
exposures to these
participants. Vous allez
health
tenter
parameters
de lier
over time.
l'exposition à ces paramètres de santé
So this is really the
au
gold
fil du temps.
standard in environmental epidemiology to
C'est la norme
assess
dans l'épidémiologie
mainly chronic
environnementale pour
exposure.
évaluer différentes
And
expositions
then you have the
cliniques.
case control studies where you have the
Ensuite, vous avez
recruitment. At the
une
time of the
étude
recruitment, the health parameter will be
contrôlée de cas
integrated because you
et
will
au niveau du
integrate a group
recrutement,
of
vous allez
cases and a group of
intégrer un groupe de
controls.
cas.
And usually it's really needed when you
C'est
have a really
essentiel
rare
lorsque vous
disease,
avez une maladie
going from
rare.
to a court will need to
Pour
integrate
aller vers une
hundreds
banque,
of
il faudra
thousands
intégrer des
of
centaines
participants
de
to
milliers de
have an
participants
enough number
pour avoir suffisamment
of cases at the end to be able to have a statistical
pour
power.
avoir
In that case, when the disease is really rare, cohorts is not really well appropriate,
Alors,
except
les
if
cohortes ne
it's
sont pas
really
vraiment
huge
très
cohorts,
appropriées, ce sont des
but they are
grandes
quite
cohortes.
rare. Then it's more
c'est
a
assez
case
rare.
control study
Et ce
where
sera
we
plus
recruit
une
cases
étude complète de
and we
cas.
try to identify
Et quand
controls
on
that are really
identifie
similar to cases
des
for all
contrôles qui
other
ressemblent aux cas
aspects,
pour
but
tous les
not
autres
for the
aspects
disease. That's how we should try
et
to
pas pour la
select
maladie.
controls.
C'est
And
ainsi qu'il faut regarder les contrôles.
retrospectively, we try to
Rétrospectivement
assess the exposure of the
parlant, il
participants
faut voir
to try
évaluer
to
l'exposition des
relate
participants
exposure to health
pour
parameters.
associer
One important
l'exposition à des
bias in this
paramètres de
kind of
santé.
studies is memory bias.
Il y a
You
le biais
might
de la
be
mémoire ici,
more
qui est
able to
important.
remember some exposure when you have a
Vous allez
disease
vous
as compared when you do not have a disease that
rappeler
is a
peut-être
priori
une
could be a priori related
maladie
to
qui
this
peut
exposure.
avoir été liée à cette exposition.
So the main step of an epidemiological research
Les
is
étapes
first to
essentielles d'une
formulate the
étude
hypothesis, to
épidémiologique, c'est de formuler
identify
des
the best
hypothèses,
study design to
d'identifier
enter
les meilleures
to test
études
this
de
hypothesis in a population.
conception d'études pour
The
tester
data
cette
collection,
étude.
recruitment, and follow-up. And actually, what I missed
Collecte de
here
données.
in between is ethical and regulatory authorization
Il y a
that
les
can
autorisations
take
réglementaires
years. Actually, in France, it
qui
can
peuvent prendre
take
des
years.
années en France.
Usually, in our team, we set
Dans votre
something that
équipe,
will take 2 years.
cela prendra
To have
habituellement
all,
2 ans.
once you have grants,
Une fois que
to
vous
be able
obtenez
to
des
start
subventions
data
pour
collection, all
démarrer
these
votre collecte de données,
ethical and regulatory authorization
toutes
might
ces
take up to 2 years, even
autorisations
sometimes more.
réglementaires pourront prendre
Then you
plus de
have
2
the
ans, voire
data
plus.
collection, recruitment, and follow-up. And if you
Ensuite, on a le
are
recrutement,
working on
le
a
recueil
cohort,
des
it will be
données
really on a
et
long time.
l'analyse
The
sur les cohortes,
characterization
ce
of the
sera plus long terme.
association of the
Et la
exposure and
caractérisation de
outcomes, so
l'association
that's where
des
you are
expositions et des
doing
résultats,
some statistical
voilà, c'est ce
analysis on the
que l'on
data to
fait
try
avec
to
les données
correlate, to
statistiques pour
estimate
essayer de
risk
corréler, pour
related
essayer
to
d'estimer
exposure.
les risques
And
liés aux
we
expositions.
are used to do some
Et on
sensitivity
a
analysis
l'habitude de
to
faire
try
des études de sensibilité
to
également
actually to test the
pour
robustness of the
essayer de
association,
tester
and
la
then we provide the
robustesse
data
de l'association et on fournit les
the
données
communication
lors de
and
communications
publication that
et
are
d'articles
important for
qui sont importants pour,
providing
je
some
veux
new
dire, pour
ideas for
fournir
preventive
de
and
nouvelles
public health
pistes
actions.
pour entreprendre des actions publiques
So
de
regarding
prévention.
exposure
En ce qui
assessment,
concerne l'évaluation de
we have
l'exposition,
multiple tools.
nous avons de
So it
nombreux
might
outils à
be
notre
questionnaires that
disposition.
are,
Ça
for
peut être des
example, really useful for
questionnaires
smoking
très
history.
utiles pour
Because
les
even if
antécédents
you
de
use some
tabagisme, parce que même
for
si on
smoking
utilise des
for a quite short
biomarqueurs
period of time, so
pour une
you are
courte
not able
période de
to
temps,
estimate
on ne sera pas en
smoking about 20
mesure
years before.
d'évaluer
So
le
anyway,
tabagisme
the
20 ans
only
auparavant.
solution here is to use
Par
some
conséquent, la seule
questionnaires.
solution, c'est d'avoir recours
And if you are
à des
interested
questionnaires.
about smoking of the parents
Si
too,
vous
for
voulez en
example,
savoir plus sur le
that's questionnaires
tabagisme
that
des
can
parents,
provide you this
alors
information.
cette information sera fournie par le
GI is
questionnaire.
based in environmental models, so these are
On
mainly
a
used for
également-
environmental air pollution, many urban
On a
exposures.
également la
You
question de
might be
l'exposition
able to use some
urbaine
pictures
et on va
or
pouvoir utiliser des
barcodes, for
images
example,
ou des
to
codes
estimate
barres afin
exposure to
d'évaluer
cleaning products, food,
l'exposition à des produits
mobile
nettoyants,
device, of
à
course,
de
in the last year have
l'alimentation,
been
à
well
des
introduced in environmental
dispositifs ou des
epidemiology,
véhicules. Donc, c'est très
including
important dans
smartphone
l'épidémiologie
accelerometers, environmental
environnementale.
sensor, for
On
example.
va utiliser également des smartphones
And
parfois
some
ou des
biomarkers in
capteurs
different tissues
environnementaux
according
et des
to what is the
biomarqueurs
most
selon les
efficient for
différents
what we want to measure.
tissus, selon
Urine, blood,
l'efficacité de ce que l'on
exert
peut
breast
mesurer.
condensate are some kind of different tissue
On va
where
également
we might measure
utiliser des
some
biomarqueurs, par exemple dans l'urine,
exposure
dans le
actually.
sang, dans les
And
condensats
we
d'expiration
have some
également.
high throughput omic technologies like
On va
epigenomics,
avoir
transcriptomic,
également
proteomic,
des
metabolomics, of course.
technologies
And for example, for epigenomics,
omiques. Par exemple, en
there is
termes
some studies that have
d'épigénomique,
identified some
il y a
specific
des études
CPGs
qui ont
that are really
identifié
correlated, highly associated with
CPG qui
smoking,
sont très
saying
associés, très
that actually,
corrélés au
rather than
tabagisme.
asking some questionnaire, as I said
Et
before,
donc, les
we might
résultats
use
via les
these CPGs
questionnaires
actually to
permettent de
identify
choisir
a
des
smoking history of the
CPG
participants,
et
exposure to
d'identifier
smoking.
le tabagisme de certains des individus
But
concernés
we
par les
have some
études. Pardon, il y a une
challenges in
coupure de
exposure
son, désolé.
assessment. First is how to estimate chronic exposure, for example, to air
Il y a la
pollutants.
question
It is quite
d'évaluer
easy in a way to
l'exposition
estimate the
aux
exposure in the
polluants
past days or
de
past year, let's say.
l'air.
But if you want to
C'est
estimate the
parfois
exposure of
difficile
the
à faire
individual
dans le
since
temps, mais on peut
several
évaluer
years,
l'exposition des
decades, of course, it is
individus
quite
des années en
really
arrière.
complex.
Donc
So
c'est assez
usually we are
complexe à
using
faire et
some
en général,
GIS-based models to
on
assess
essaye
exposures, but let's say
d'utiliser
that it remains quite challenging aspect.
différents types de modèles pour ce faire.
Exposure to ubiquitous chemical compounds like
L'exposition
endocrine
à des
disruptor, where you have actually
composés
some multiple
chimiques qui sont
sources. So
partout
the
avec de
questionnaire will
nombreuses
not help
sources,
you
comme les
because there is
PVC
some
par
multiple
exemple.
sources. I
Il y a
mean,
de très nombreuses
it's really
sources.
difficult to identify
C'est
from
très
questionnaires. So
difficile à
we are more
identifier via
using
les
for that, for
questionnaires.
example,
Par conséquent, on va plutôt utiliser
biomarkers.
les biomarqueurs
You have exposure assessed for
avec des
biomarkers with
cycles
short
de
half-lives.
vie assez courts.
So meaning that if you measure the biomarkers in one sample,
De vie
then
assez
in a
courte.
unique
Par exemple, on
sample,
va
then you
faire
will
dans
measure
un seul
exposure of the
échantillon.
last
Ensuite, on va
last
mesurer
few hours.
l'exposition
But if
pour
you are
des toutes
interested in
dernières heures. Mais
chronic
si on est
exposure,
plus
you can see that,
intéressé par
it's
l'exposition
not
chronique, on voit
appropriate.
que cet outil-là, le biomarqueur, n'est pas approprié.
Actually, in our team, part of our
Et dans
research
notre
work is
équipe, une
methodological.
partie de
We are
notre travail
aiming
de
at
recherche est
improving assessment of
méthodologique.
exposure
On
to environmental
essaie
factors to be more able
d'améliorer
to associate
l'évaluation de
environmental
l'exposition
exposure to
pour
health.
associer
So one
l'exposition
example is,
environnementale
for
aux effets sur la
example,
santé.
for endocrine disruptor, where we
On a par
have
exemple
some
l'impact
metabolites in the
des
urine,
erreurs
but with
d'évaluation
really
dans
short
les
half-lives. You
évaluations
have on the left part
de
of the
l'exposition
graph,
sur la
actually,
gauche ici,
here,
comme vous pouvez
the
le
measurement
voir.
for one woman in
La
each
mesure
urine
pour
sample,
une
we
femme dans
measure
chaque
different
prélèvement d'urine. On
metabolites
a
of endocrine
mesuré
disruptors, and you
différents
can see a
métabolites dans
really
les
huge variability over
PEC.
time
On voit
that
une
is really
grande
related to
variation au
the
cours du temps
half-life
qui
of this
est
compound.
liée
So, for
aux
example,
demi-vie
if you
de ce
measure
composé.
ethylparaben, this
Par exemple, si on
on that
évalue
sample, you will say that the
l'éthylparabène,
woman is
sur
quite highly
ce
exposed.
prélèvement, on va
But
voir
if
que
you
la femme
measure
est très
it
exposée,
in
mais
this
si on le
sample, you will say that the
mesure
woman is actually really poorly exposed.
autrement,
So,
d'une autre
and at
manière, on
the
verra
end,
qu'elle est
on
finalement peu
reality,
exposée.
this
Et
is
en
some things in
réalité,
between.
la
So,
vérité est quelque part entre les deux.
we cannot do that
Par
for
conséquent,
a
on ne peut
cohort
pas
because it's
faire
really
cela au niveau
expensive.
d'une
We cannot
cohorte car c'est très
measure
coûteux. On ne
all
peut pas
biomarkers for a
évaluer
week
tous
or
les
even 2
biomarqueurs pendant
weeks for
1
all
à 2
women.
semaines pour
So what
toutes
we
les
have
femmes. Par
proposed is
conséquent, ce
actually
que nous
to
avons
pool
proposé
urine samples
est de
during
prélever
a week,
de
3
l'urine
urine
sur
samples
une
a day
semaine,
during a week, and
3
we have
échantillons
done that
d'urine par
2
jour sur une
weeks at
semaine.
the
On a
second
fait
and
ça
third trimester of
pour
pregnancy
2
in a
semaines
birth
pour
in
les
the mother-child
premiers
cohort,
trimestres
and then we are
de
putting the samples
grossesse et
during the
ensuite au niveau des
week.
cohortes et ensuite
So 21 urine samples
on a
collected that are pooled, and we are
21
measuring in
prélèvements
the pooled
d'urine qui
sample
sont
the
collectés
biomarkers.
et
And
ensuite on
that's
les met
something
en
really
commun
important
et on
because
teste
if you
avec
have
les
this
biomarqueurs.
quite
C'est très important.
of this strong variability over time,
Si on
if
a
you
une
are
très forte
trying to
variation dans
assess the
le temps,
association
on
between
essaie
ethylparaben and
d'évaluer
one
l'association de l'éthylparabène
health parameter,
et les
what has been
paramètres
shown
One
is
Health.
that you have a
Ce
really
qui est
limited statistical
montré,
power
c'est qu'on a un
because you will
pouvoir statistique très limité.
systematically underestimate
On
the
va
association.
systématiquement sous-estimer cette association.
Another example is about
Un
air
autre
pollution, where we
exemple
have a
de
really
pollution dans
changed
l'air.
things over time.
On essaie
With, for
d'améliorer la mesure
example,
d'exposition à
here,
la
where
pollution de
firstly
l'air.
we measured exposure in
On
stations.
mesure
So, for example, in
l'exposition dans
that
des
case, we
différentes
have only 3
stations.
stations for
Là, on
this
avait
city.
simplement
So the
3
participants,
stations
according to their
pour
proximity
la
to the
ville,
station,
et donc ça va dépendre de la proximité
received
à la
actually the same
station
level
de
of
mesure.
exposure. So
Et
it
donc on
was
voit
quite
qu'ils ont
crude way
tous
to do it.
reçu
Then we
la
are
même
using
quantité
now much
d'exposition
more
finalement.
the
C'était assez grossier finalement.
model of exposure,
Aujourd'hui,
where
on
you
a
have
différents
1
modèles
kilometer
d'exposition.
on a
On a
grid
par
of 1
exemple
kilometer
sur
by
une
1
grille, on
kilometer,
a
so it's
kilomètre
much
par
more
kilomètre, c'est beaucoup plus
precise here.
précis.
And so firstly, it has been developed for some
Tout
specific
d'abord,
cities,
on a
but then
développé ce
now we
modèle
have
pour
some map
certaines
for different
villes en particulier,
countries
mais
like this
aujourd'hui,
one.
on a
And
des
now we are
cartes par
integrating
pays, comme
GPS
celle-ci par
data
exemple,
accelerometers to
et on a
try
également
to even
l'utilisation de
better
données
account
GPS
for
pour être
the
encore plus précis.
How people move actually in the
Et
city to
cela
account
permet
for that in the
d'établir
exposure
le
assessment.
mode de déplacement des individus dans la ville
So the
et
exposure, I
l'exposition
think,
afférente.
do I have 5 minutes more?
Est-ce que j'ai encore 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I will
Okay,
be really
no more.
brief.
Alors, 5 minutes, mais
Okay,
pas plus.
so for the exposome, actually,
En ce qui concerne
the exposome is
l'exposome,
defined as the totality of human
l'exposome est
environmental
défini
exposure from
comme la
conception onwards,
totalité de
complementing the
l'exposition
genome,
environnementale.
as defined by Christopher
Et cela va
White.
compléter le génome,
This
comme
is,
cela a été défini par
he
Christopher White
wanted
en
actually
2005.
to
Et ils ont
underline the fact
souhaité
that
souligner le fait
there was
que
a disequilibrium between
s'il y
the
avait un
characterization of genetics in
déséquilibre dans la
epidemiology,
caractérisation de la
where
génétique
we
et
invested a
l'environnement
lot of money
en
as
épidémiologie,
compared to environmental exposure, where it was
si on le
based
compare
on few
à l'exposition
questions on a
environnementale.
questionnaire.
Et cela est
So it
basé
was a main
sur les
idea
réponses
when
recueillies
exposome
avec des
concept has
questionnaires.
been
Et donc
coined
le
for the
concept
first
de
time. And now
l'exposome a
there
été
is an exponential
conçu
use
pour la première
of
fois.
the exposome concept
Aujourd'hui,
and
on a
and
une
more
utilisation
studies related to
exponentielle de cette
this
notion d'exposome. Il y a
exposome
de plus en
concept.
plus d'études autour de l'exposome.
So in terms of
Par
statistics,
conséquent, en
when
termes de
you look at the
statistiques,
association between
si
environment and
on
health,
observe
most of the studies
l'association
conducted
entre
so far
l'environnement
looked
et
at
la
single
santé,
exposure
on voit
health
qu'il y a
association study
une
when we look at
seule
only whether one exposure
association,
will drive
exposition
the
santé.
association.
Et bien sûr, on va
And
aller encore
actually,
plus loin.
that's
Et
what
en
we have
fait,
done for a long
c'est
time.
ce que nous faisons
And
depuis
actually,
longtemps.
we have to admit that we identified
Par
some
conséquent, nous
associations.
devons accepter
And
que
for
nous
example,
avons réussi à
regarding
identifier
asthma, a
certaines
large range
associations,
of environmental
comme pour
factors and
l'asthme.
behaviors have been
Il y a une
identified
large
or have been
gamme de
suspected
facteurs
to be involved in the
environnementaux qui
development
sont
or exacerbation of
suspectés
asthma
de
using this
développer
kind of studies
l'incidence
where
de l'asthme
focusing on a
et sa
single
gravité.
exposure.
Et parfois, on peut se
But
concentrer sur une
there
seule
are some
exposition.
weaknesses
Mais
related
cependant,
to
il y
the
a aussi
fact
des
that
faiblesses
we
dues
are
au
not
fait que
adjusting for
nous
all the exposure of the
n'ajustons pas
participants, so which
pour toutes
might
les
bias
expositions
the
de chaque
result.
participant. Donc, par conséquent,
There
il y
is
a
a
un
publication
biais
bias
qui
where we
pèse
know
sur
that
les
negative
études.
results are less often
Et
reported in
parfois,
the
il y a des
literature.
résultats
The
négatifs
multiple
rapportés
tests
par
are
la
not visible,
littérature
so
et
it
de
means
nombreux
that we
tests ne sont
might
pas
have
visibles, ce qui veut
concluded
dire
to some
que
spurious association to
on
be
peut
true
avoir
association.
conclu
And
à
actually, the
des
mixture effect,
associations
meaning that the
erronées.
effect of the exposure
Là,
to the
ici, il
whole
s'agit de
population, to
l'effet
the
de
whole
mélange
environment together,
ou
is
peut-être
not taken into account with this kind of approach.
d'exposition
So we are
mixte
moving to a
qui n'est pas
more
toujours prise en compte
integrated
par ce type
approach,
d'approche.
which are the
Donc, on a une approche
exposome-wide
aujourd'hui plus
association study,
intégrée
where
avec
in that kind of study, we are not looking to
plus
one
large.
environmental factor, but to a
On
large
observe
set
parfois
of
un
exposure
seul
and one health
facteur
outcomes.
d'environnement
But
et
we are doing
un
that
effet
through a
sur la
single
santé.
exposure regression-based
Et
model, meaning that
on
we
le
are looking, for
fait,
example, for
par
atmospheric
exemple,
pollutants to
pour les
asthma,
polluants
and then in the
atmosphériques et
same
le lien avec
population,
l'asthme.
we
Et sur
look
la
at
même
much more
population,
environmental
on
factors.
va
But each
étudier
environmental
beaucoup
factor will
plus
be
de
considered
facteurs
in a way
environnementaux
isolated from the
qui
other.
seront
The good
considérés comme
thing is
isolés
that
les uns
it
des autres.
provided, so
L'aspect
this is
positif
an
ici,
example, just if you want
par
to
exemple,
have
si ça vous
more
intéresse,
ideas that we published few years ago. It was one
donc
of the
ça, c'est
first
une
attempts
publication
to
qui date de quelques
estimate
années.
the
C'était la
effect
première fois qu'on a estimé
of the exposome
les
on
effets
FEV1,
de
and we were
l'exposome
able to identify a group
sur le
of
FEV. Pardon, et cela
suspected,
s'interrompt à
let's say,
cause de la connexion de mauvaise
suspected
qualité.
environmental exposures that would need more research, and in
Et
particular,
parfois, cela nécessite
chemical
plus
exposure
de
were
recherche,
identified in
notamment
this
sur
large
l'exposition aux
exposome
produits chimiques.
study.
Mais bon, là,
So the
c'était
strength
sur
is
une
that
étude
it allows
assez
adjustment
large
for
sur
potential
l'exposome.
co-exposure. It limits the risk for publication bias as we provide a
On
catalog
essaie
of the
également de
association
limiter
with
le
which
biais
exposure
dans ces
factor,
études
and we
prenant
are
en compte
addressing issues
l'exposome
related to
et
multiple
on
tests.
traite les
But there are
problèmes
some
posés
weaknesses
par
as we
les
need
études
large sample
à
size
multiples
related to
tests.
the multiplicity of tests.
On a bien sûr
And
donc cette question de la
again, the
multiplicité des
mixture
tests et à
effect of
nouveau
exposure is not addressed
l'effet
with that
de
kind of
mélange des différents polluants
models.
n'est pas traité
So
par ces
now we are more
modèles-là.
using some
Par
approaches that
conséquent, on
are
utilise
aimed
des
to address
approches
the effect
qui
of
tendent
combined
à
exposure
traiter les effets des expositions combinées
to the effect of this combined exposure on health
et
outcomes.
ces effets combinés sur la
And this
santé.
is highly relevant because this is in
C'est très
agreement with exposure
pertinent
in
car
real
c'est
life.
en
We cannot
accord
just summarize
avec
one
les
individual by this
expositions
is a
dans
smoking
la vie
status, at the
réelle.
same time is eating, is drinking, he's
Donc,
breathing
on va
other air
par exemple
pollutants,
étudier
so
les
it's really
habitudes
more in agreement with
d'exposition aux polluants
life.
atmosphériques
And it is with
On
the
a beaucoup d'interruptions dues à la connexion Internet qui est interrompue.
So there are different questions, and that leads to various statistical approaches.
Donc, il y a beaucoup de questions différentes avec des variations statistiques.
Whether we are aiming to estimate an overall effect of mixture on the outcome, so there is some different statistical to do that. Whether we are seeking for specific interaction effect among mixture of pollutants. Whether we are aiming to estimate the independent health effect of each pollutant, but in the context of the exposure to the mixture, and whether we want to identify patterns of exposure in the study population and assess the effect of these patterns of exposure on health. So I do not have to go in details on that, but let's say that we cannot tell you today, for exposure study, please use the statistical approaches that have been used to be the best one, as it really depends on the scientific question behind this Exposome Health Association study.
Le type de questions que l'on souhaite poser.
So I'm coming to the conclusion.
J'en arrive à ma conclusion.
So actually, environmental epidemiology really provided important results that contributed to preventive measures or to better health management of the patients. The Exposome approach provided really new perspectives, but new challenges too, to be honest. And as I said, if you are interested in this Exposome approach, at this step, there is no established statistical model for that. It's quite complex. But to me, we will never have that because we really have some different scientific questions behind this Exposome Health Association study, so that we'll need different statistical models. And I think we need to push you to this more integrative research to better understand the effect of environmental health by integrating environmental science, statistics, epidemiology, social science, toxicology, biology, medicine, that all together I think will be able to really improve our understanding how environment actually represents a threat for health in the population level.
La santé des populations
and then I want to thank all people who are participating in my team or within the consortium we are involved to try to provide some new results in this domain.
De nouvelles perspectives, de
Many
nouveaux résultats dans
thanks.
ce domaine. Merci
And
beaucoup
I'm
pour
ready
votre
for
attention
question.
et je suis prêt à répondre à vos questions si vous en avez.
Thanks, Valérie. We're a bit over time, so we won't skip the questions, but we will perhaps
on a encore un
try
peu de
to
temps.
have only 2 or 3.
Peut-être qu'on peut prendre 2 à 3 questions. Y a-t-il donc des questions dans l'assistance?
I can start. I was wondering about this idea that we need to pool the samples to be able to have a clear overview of the exposure of the non-persistent chemicals. Is there a threshold or something that you have in mind where you need to have, I don't know, for compounds that are with 8 hours that you eliminate in less than 8 hours, you need to pool, and if you keep them more than 8 hours, it's okay not to pool, or there is no threshold, and it's something that you can use for any kind of compounds.
Sector question. Actually, this is really interesting.
C'est une question très pertinente, merci.
In our team, there is colleagues working on that, but not exactly on that way, actually. It's more related, what we have done is to look at the, in statistics, you have the intra-class coefficient correlation, which provides you to which extent measures taken over time correlate to each other. And then when you have a quite high correlation, let's say not too bad, let's say that in that case you might have 6 urine samples, for example, could be enough. But when you have a really strong variability, I've shown for ethyl paraben, then if you really want to have a good estimate of the medium exposure, let's say, you might need more. about 20 samples. So we have some indication about that, but not on the way you are saying it, maybe in terms of time, but more on terms of level of correlation over time. But I agree that some things we could work on.
Qu'il y a des sujets que nous pourrions approfondir. Merci.
Any question?
D'autres questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation.
Merci beaucoup pour
and
votre
I have heard
présentation.
about the outcome-wide study, but it's my first time to heard about the exposome-wide association. So I'm curious about do you consider the time order of the exposome, for example, this exposure comes first or this exposure comes after, or do you consider the period of the exposure,
arrive en premier, et puis celle-là en deuxième, ou alors plutôt le facteur temps.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood well. Are you talking about when we are measuring the exposure?
Vous parlez de mesurer les expositions,
well, yeah, you're totally true. I mean, from the exposome study, actually, there is
les études liées à l'exposome.
We know now that the first thousands of days for the children will be really important for the health all over his life. So there is some important windows of exposures that and where environmental exposure may be more at risk for the individual than later on. So in the really early life, it might be really an important window of time where we have to measure environmental exposures. And what is I agree that environment, and actually the exposome is a concept, is all environmental exposure you are exposed to since birth, and even since conception. So that's something we cannot be able to measure. Let's say that for children, we are really interested in early life, but for adults, it would be really important to still have this early life exposure anyway, and then to have some important information all over the life of the individuals. So it really depends on the research questions, where some specific environmental exposure may be more at risk in different time periods. But let's say that to answer your question, the ideal would be to have repeated information of exposure over the life to be really well able to understand the windows at risk and to really have a good overview of the effect of the environment on the health of the individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we should close now the session. Thanks, Valérie, for this
Merci beaucoup,
very nice and very important points that you raised during your presentation.
Très bien.
Okay.
Merci Valérie.
Thank you to all.
Merci,
and really sorry again for not being with you.
Mes amitiés à Rémi Slama.
Désolé de ne pas être présent.
Je ne manquerai pas.
Greetings to my friend Rémi Slama.